They say the most dangerous man in the room is the one who has nothing to lose. They're wrong. The most dangerous man is the one who owns the room, but acts like he's just cleaning it. Julian Vane thought he was the new king of the docks. He thought he could sell his father's legacy for a few million and a gold watch. He didn't realize that the trash he was kicking was the very man who could erase his entire existence with a single word. Victor the Ghost Volkov stood in the shadows of the loading bay, his massive frame made small by the deliberate slump of his shoulders. The navy blue coveralls he wore were stiff with salt and stained with the honest grease of the iron port. To anyone passing by, he was just Vic, the probationary janitor with a nameless face and a quiet tongue. But beneath the unkempt hair and the smudge of oil on his jaw, his gray eyes remained as sharp as cold steel, mapping every twitch of Julian's insecure body. Julian paced the gantry above, his light gray suit a clinical blue under the warehouse lights. He looked down at the men who built the Volkov empire and saw nothing but tools to be traded. He checked his gold smartwatch again, the movement frantic and loud against the heavy silence of the bay. He was waiting for a call that would bypass the accountants and deliver a 15% leak straight into his pocket. He thought he was playing the game. He didn't realize he was the piece being moved. As Julian barked an order for someone to clear the chemical spill near the primary crane, Victor stepped forward. He knelt, taking the hand brush into a grip that had once crushed the throats of rivals. He felt the cold spray of the harbor wind against his neck, a reminder of the iron world that Julian had forgotten in his pursuit of the silk. With every rhythmic scrub of the brush, Victor listened. He heard the distant, frantic argument of the board members over the hands-free system and the low, predatory hum of the city beyond. Julian sneered down at him, his expensive cologne clashing with the heavy scent of industrial oil. "Scrub harder, Vic. I want to see my reflection in that floor by midnight." Victor didn't look up. He didn't have to. He could feel the boy's arrogance radiating like heat from a dying fire. Julian thought power was the scream. Victor knew power was the silence that followed. As the ghost of Volkov Bay continued his work, he knew the debt was mounting. Julian Vane was busy polishing a crown that was already slipping, unaware that the man at his feet was simply waiting for the right moment to stand up and let the world see who really owned the night. Victor Volkov officially stepped into the role of a ghost. His arrival at Volkov Bay marked not by fanfare, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of his own boots on the rain-slicked concrete. Clad in navy blue coveralls that felt like a secondary skin, he moved through the bay with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the shadows. The air at the docks was thick, a heavy mixture of salt, rusted iron, and the impending storm, illuminated by a low, gritty amber glow that seemed to cling to the industrial machinery like a second coat of paint. The silence of the morning was shattered by the arrival of Julian Vane. He stepped out of his sleek sedan, a figure of sharp, clinical blue lighting that cut through the warm gloom of the docks like a surgical blade. His light gray suit was a declaration of war against the grime surrounding him, and his gaze, as it landed on Victor, was filled with a casual, inherited cruelty. "You." Julian barked, his voice carrying the hollow resonance of a man who mistook volume for authority. He pointed a gold-ringed finger toward a shimmering chemical spill that bled across the floor near the main loading crane. "The floor is a disgrace, and I'm expecting a VIP arrival. Clean it, now." Victor didn't argue. He didn't even look up. He simply knelt, his massive frame casting a long amber-tinted shadow against the cold floor as he took a stiff hand brush into his grip. Every scrub was a lesson in unbreakable discipline, a rhythmic penance performed under the mocking gaze of the crew. Julian stood over him for a moment, the sharp blue glow of his digital world clashing with the gritty physical reality of Victor's work, before he turned away with a sneer. As Victor scrubbed, his ears tuned to the frequency of betrayal. Julian retreated to a dark corner of the gantry, his gold smartwatch glowing faintly as he took a call. The voice on the other end was distorted, but the tone was unmistakable. "The Vipers." Julian whispered into the phone, his eyes darting toward the janitor, who seemed entirely absorbed in his menial task. He spoke of shipment schedules and blind spots in the security grid, selling the syndicate's lifeblood for a fraction of its worth. Julian thought he was the architect of a new empire, but Victor, watching the reflection of the false prince in the chemical puddle, knew the truth. The debt was being recorded, and at Volkov Bay, the ghost always collected. The moon over Volkov Bay was a pale, sickly silver, choked by the low-hanging smog of the industrial district. Victor stood at the edge of the south gate, his navy blue coveralls blending into the heavy, amber-tinted shadows of the shipping containers. Earlier that evening, Julian had delivered the order with a condescending pat on Victor's shoulder, a gesture that smelled of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. "Keep your eyes open, Vic," Julian had mocked, his sharp blue eyes glinting under the office lights. "This shipment is worth more than your life. Try not to fall asleep on the job." Now the only sound was the rhythmic, distant slap of the tide against the pier. Victor remained perfectly still, his unbreakable discipline transforming him into a part of the machinery. At precisely 12:15 a.m., the low hum of a diesel engine vibrated through the asphalt. A black transport truck, its lights extinguished, rolled slowly toward a secondary exit. Victor watched from the darkness as Julian's hand-picked private security team stood by. They didn't reach for their weapons. They didn't even look up from their phones. They were a vision of silk corporate rot, meticulously trained to overlook the very crime they were paid to prevent. The truck diverted from its manifest path, slipping through the gate like a ghost. Victor's hands remained steady, tucked into his pockets. He didn't intervene. He didn't shout. Instead, his fingers worked a hidden device, the tiny lens capturing the high-definition betrayal of the false prince. He watched the truck vanish into the city, recording the faces of the guards and the license plate of the Viper's courier. 10 minutes later, the screech of Julian's tires announced his arrival. He stepped out of his car, the sharp, blue-white glow of his smartphone illuminating a face twisted into a mask of feigned outrage. He marched toward Victor, his gold smartwatch catching the dim industrial light. "You useless fossil!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with a forced intensity. "A truck just pulled a phantom exit right under your nose. Do you have any idea what you've cost the company?" He stepped closer, his face inches from Victor's grease-stained jaw. "You're too slow, Vic. Too old. You're a bug in a system you don't even understand." Victor kept his head slightly bowed, the picture of a shamed, incompetent laborer. But beneath the facade, his gray eyes were locked on Julian's pulse, visible and frantic in his neck. He wasn't listening to the insults. He was calculating the debt. Julian thought he was mocking a failure. He had no idea he was being studied by a predator who had already decided the exact moment the silk would finally tear. The smell of the Viper arrived before the man did, a pungent chemical scent of cheap cologne and expensive tobacco that cut through the salt of the bay. A mid-level enforcer for the Vipers, a man named Kale with a jagged scar and a leather jacket that creaked with every movement, stepped into the amber-lit loading zone. He carried himself with the loud, vibrating energy of a man who thought he had finally climbed high enough to look down on others. Victor stood by the heavy iron gate, his shoulders slumped and his gaze fixed on the oil-stained concrete. He was holding a rusted bucket, his navy blue coveralls marked with the fresh grime of a double shift. To Kyle, Victor was nothing more than part of the scenery, a piece of human furniture that had outlived its usefulness. "Hey, old man," Kyle sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp. He didn't wait for a response before he propped a mud-caked boot up on Victor's knee, using the janitor as a literal footstool, while he leaned back to light a thick, dark cigar. Victor didn't flinch. His unbreakable discipline held his muscles as still as the heavy cranes overhead. Though he could feel the weight of the man's disrespect in his marrow, Kyle took a long drag, his eyes scanning the warehouse for Julian Vane before leaning in close. He exhaled a thick gray cloud of smoke directly into Victor's face, watching with a sadistic grin to see if the laborer would cough or recoil. Victor remained a statue. Through the stinging haze, his steel-gray eyes stayed focused and cold, watching the way Kale shifted his weight, noting the specific Viper insignia tattooed on the man's throat, and recording the frequency of the encrypted radio chirping on his belt. Every insult was data. Every second of humiliation was a mapping of the Viper's hierarchy. Victor wasn't just enduring the smoke, he was tracing it back to the fire. He saw the way the other dockworkers turned their heads in shame, and the way Julian watched from the high glass office, hidden behind his sharp blue lights and a cowardly silence. "You're a good dog, Vic," Kale laughed, kicking his foot away and flicking a hot ash onto Victor's chest. "Stay quiet, stay small, and maybe you'll live to see the sunrise." Victor watched him walk toward the office to collect the payoff, his mind already dismantling the enforcer's security. The Viper thought he had asserted dominance over a janitor. He had no idea he had just handed the ghost the keys to his entire organization. The smell of the lower decks was a suffocating cocktail of stagnant seawater, rotted organic matter, and industrial runoff. It was here, in the dark, damp bowels of Volkov Bay, that Julian Vane stood like a misplaced statue of ivory and silk. A sudden frantic movement had sent his custom-made gold cufflink skittering across the iron grating and into the thick, black bilge water below. Julian's face contorted into a mask of petulant rage, his sharp, blue-white lighting flickering as he looked down at the filth he refused to touch. "Down there, Vic," Julian commanded, his voice echoing hollowly against the rusted hull. He pointed a trembling finger toward the lightless gap in the floorboards. "It's worth more than your life. Get in there and don't come back up until you find it." Victor didn't hesitate. He lowered his massive frame into the crawl space. The freezing, oily sludge soaking into his navy blue coveralls and clinging to his skin like a heavy burial shroud. He moved through the darkness with a predator's patience, his unbreakable discipline acting as an anchor while he waded through the waste of the empire he had built. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of the gold link, buried deep in the silt, but he stayed down a moment longer, listening to the frantic, uneven breathing of the man above him. When Victor finally emerged, he was unrecognizable, a creature of shadow and slime. He hauled himself onto the grating, the bilge water dripping from his jaw as he held out the glinting gold trinket in a steady, grease-stained hand. Julian reached for it, his lip curling in disgust. But as Victor stood up to his full height, he caught the younger man's reflection in a stagnant, oily puddle on the floor. In that dark, liquid mirror, the mask of the false prince finally cracked. Victor didn't see the arrogant manager or the heir to the throne. He saw a boy whose eyes were wide with a primal, suffocating fear. Julian wasn't looking at a janitor. He was looking into a void he couldn't control. The realization was written in every twitch of Julian's gaze. The boy knew he was drowning in a game far larger than his ego, and the trash he was kicking was the only thing keeping him from the abyss. Victor watched him retreat into the blue light, knowing that the broken mirror had revealed the truth. The king was already home, and the prince was already lost. The pressure of the missing millions was beginning to crush Julian Vane, and like all weak men, his first instinct was to find a sacrifice. He stood in his glass-walled office, bathed in that sterile, sharp blue light, watching the dockworkers through the window with the cold detachment of a man looking at disposable tools. His plan was simple and desperate, a staged police raid that would discover a stash of Viper contraband in the lockers of 3 veteran workers. It would give the authorities a win, cover the 15% revenue leak as simple theft, and wipe Julian's hands clean of his mounting debts to the underworld. Victor moved through the loading bay at twilight, his silhouette melding into the gritty amber shadows cast by the industrial lamps. His unbreakable discipline allowed him to move with a silence that defied his massive frame, observing Julian's private security detail as they planted a crate of high-grade narcotics beneath a false floor in the break room. They worked quickly, assuming the janitor was occupied with the sludge of the bilge pumps, but the ghost was always watching. When the guards retreated to wait for the sirens, Victor acted. With the practiced efficiency of the king he truly was, he retrieved the planted evidence, his old-school tattoos briefly catching the dim orange light as he worked. He didn't dispose of the contraband. He relocated it to the one place the police would never think to look, until they had no choice. He slipped into the silk world of the upper offices, leaving the crate hidden inside the mahogany desk where Julian sat, dreaming of his false empire. As the night deepened, the atmosphere at Volkov Bay became electric with a rising, unspoken tension. Julian paced his office, his gold smartwatch vibrating with frantic messages from the Vipers, but the raid he had orchestrated never materialized as planned. He felt the walls closing in, a cold, invisible hand tightening around his throat. Emerging from his office, Julian's gaze fell on Victor, who was calmly mopping the floor outside his door. "You!" Julian spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and burgeoning panic. "Every time I turn around, you're there. You're a jinx, Vic, a walking disaster." He blamed the trash for his own bad luck, unaware that the disaster he feared was already sitting right under his hands. Victor merely kept his head down, the steel gray of his eyes hidden by the shadows, watching the false prince crumble under the weight of a debt he could never pay. The rain began as a relentless rhythmic drumming against the roof of the luxury sedan, blurring the neon lights of the city into long, jagged streaks of blue and gold. Victor sat behind the wheel, his massive frame forced into the cramped driver's seat, still clad in the salt-stained navy blue coveralls that marked him as a servant. In the back, Julian Vane sat in the sharp, clinical shadows of the leather interior, his movements frantic as he checked his gold smartwatch. He had ordered Vic to drive because his regular security had mysteriously vanished, unaware that the ghost had already begun pruning the dead wood from his empire. The car glided through the industrial district toward a secluded warehouse, a place where the amber glow of the docks was replaced by the cold, dead darkness of the Viper's territory. Julian wasn't alone in the back for long. At a rain-slicked corner, the door opened to admit a man wrapped in the heavy scent of expensive tobacco and predatory intent, the leader of the Vipers. Victor kept his gaze fixed on the road, his eyes reflecting the flickering streetlights like cold, steel-gray mirrors. He listened as the two men began to speak, their voices hushed but dripping with the arrogance of those who believe they are unheard. They spoke of the 15% leak, of the failed raid, and finally of the ghost they both feared but had never seen. Julian's voice was a desperate high-pitched rasp as he offered a final solution to his mounting debts, a coordinated strike to assassinate the head of the Volkov syndicate. "The ghost is a myth," Julian sneered, leaning forward, his face illuminated by the sharp blue light of his phone. "But his lieutenants are real. We kill them, and the empire is ours." The Viper leader laughed, a dry, rattling sound, and agreed to the bloodbath. They plotted the death of the man sitting less than 3 feet away, dismissing the janitor in the front seat as nothing more than a mindless tool of the machinery. Victor's only reaction was the slow, steady tightening of his hands on the steering wheel. His knuckles turned white, the old-school black ink tattoos on his forearms straining against the fabric of his sleeves, the only visible sign of the king beneath the janitor. He didn't interrupt. He didn't breathe a word. He simply drove them deeper into the night, recording every detail of their treason with an unbreakable focus. The shadows of the car held 2 men who thought they were masters of the world, and 1 ghost who knew they were already dead. The warehouse air was thick and stagnant, heavy with the scent of wet concrete and the metallic tang of impending violence. The meeting of shadows had reached its inevitable conclusion. The Viper leader stepped back into the sharp, blue-white light, a cold smile cutting across his face as his men drew their weapons. They didn't point them at the ghost they couldn't see. They pointed them at Julian Vane. The false prince froze, his $3,000 suit suddenly feeling like a shroud as the realization hit him. To the Vipers, he wasn't a partner. He was just a loose end that needed to be trimmed. Julian cowered, his knees buckling as he slipped from the gantry, stumbling into the gritty amber glow of the main floor. "Wait," he choked out, his voice a pathetic rasp that betrayed his silk upbringing. "We had a deal." The Viper enforcers only laughed, the sound echoing hollowly against the corrugated iron walls. Then the world shifted. Victor Volkov, the man who had been nothing more than a background shadow in navy blue coveralls, finally stood up straight. The submissive slump of his shoulders vanished, replaced by a wall of muscle that seemed to fill the entire warehouse. He shed the Vic persona with a single fluid motion, ripping the grease-stained coverall down to his waist to reveal a black t-shirt that gripped his massive frame. The movement exposed the intricate old-school black ink tattoos that spiraled down his forearms, marks of a history written in blood and iron. The first enforcer lunged, his gun leveled, but Victor was a blur of calculated motion. With a hand that had spent weeks holding a scrubbing brush, Victor shattered the man's wrist before he could pull the trigger, disarming him with a terrifying, silent efficiency. The second Viper fired, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding, but Victor was already there, a predator in his natural habitat. He used the first man's body as a shield, closing the distance in 2 steps and delivering a strike that sent the second enforcer spiraling into the darkness of the shipping containers. The third man hesitated, his hands shaking as he looked into Victor's cold, steel-gray eyes. Eyes that didn't belong to a janitor, but to a king. Victor didn't give him a chance to recover. In the flickering amber light, he disarmed the final threat with his bare hands, the metallic clatter of the weapon hitting the floor, the only sound in the sudden silence. Julian watched from the floor in paralyzed shock, his mouth agape as he looked up at the man he had kicked and mocked. The trash had risen, and for the first time in his life, Julian Vane was looking at the ghost of Volkov Bay. The transition from the blood-stained concrete of the warehouse to the obsidian elegance of the obsidian room was a descent into a different kind of nightmare. Julian Vane was dragged through the doors, his $3,000 suit, now a tattered wreck, stained with the bilge water of the docks and the sweat of a man who had stared into the abyss. He was shoved into a chair that felt too large, his surroundings a blur of deep mahogany crystal glass and a silence so heavy it felt physical. At the head of the long, dark table sat Victor Volkov. The grease and the navy blue coveralls were gone, replaced by a black tailored suit that fit his massive frame like armor. He sat perfectly still, his hands, the same hands that had scrubbed Julian's floors, now resting calmly on the table. The ghost was no longer hiding. In the warm amber glow of the chandelier, Victor's steel-gray eyes held a weight that made the air in the room feel thin. Julian tried to speak, his voice a broken whisper. "Vic, please." Victor didn't blink. "Vic is dead, Julian. He died the moment you thought your father's name was a shield for your cowardice." The heavy doors at the far end of the room swung open. The leader of the Vipers, the man who had plotted with Julian just hours ago, walked in. He didn't come in with guns drawn or words of defiance. He took one look at the man at the head of the table and stopped. His face went pale, the predatory arrogance he had shown at the docks vanishing instantly. Without a word, the rival boss dropped his head and bowed deeply, his forehead nearly touching his knees. "Lord Volkov," the man rasped, his voice trembling. I was told you were gone." "I was never gone," Victor replied, his voice a low, steady thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. "I was just watching the trash pile up." Julian watched the scene in a state of paralyzed horror. Every lie he had told himself, every moment of perceived superiority, shattered. The man he had treated like a footstool was the sun around which the entire underworld orbited. He wasn't a partner in a coup. He was a fly caught in a web he hadn't even seen. The nightmare wasn't that he was going to die. The nightmare was the sudden crushing realization that he had never truly lived. He had only existed by the grace of a man he wasn't even fit to clean for. The King's Court was in session, and Julian Vane was the only one without a seat. The silence in the obsidian room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, uneven breathing of Julian Vane. He waited for the sentence, for the flash of steel or the deafening crack of a bullet that would end his terror. But Victor Volkov simply leaned back, his steel-gray eyes studying the trembling wreck of a man before him with a clinical, detached pity. Execution was for rivals. Julian was something else entirely. He was a debt that needed to be balanced. "You like the silk, Julian," Victor said, his voice a low, melodic thrum. "You like the weight of gold on your wrist and the way a name can open doors you didn't build. But a name is just a ghost if there's no man behind it." Victor signaled to a shadowed figure in the corner. "As of this moment, Julian Vane no longer exists. The accounts have been drained. The properties are seized. Your father's legacy has been scrubbed clean of your stain." Julian's face went a ghostly white, his mouth working but no sound emerging. You can't." "I can," Victor replied, standing up to his full, imposing height. "And I have. You wanted to run the docks? Now you will, but not from the gantry." He tossed a heavy folded pile of fabric onto the table. It was a pair of navy blue industrial coveralls, faded and smelling of salt and grease. A generic name tag was pinned to the chest. Vic. You will work the night shift at Volkov Bay. You will clean the spills. You will scrub the floors. And you will do it until you understand that power isn't something you inherit. It's something you survive. Julian looked at the coveralls as if they were made of lead. He realized then that Victor wasn't giving him a second chance. He was giving him a life sentence of invisibility. He was being cast into the very shadows he had mocked, forced to become the trash he once thought he could kick. Victor didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the broken prince in the ruins of his own ego. He stepped out onto the pier of the Iron Port, where the sky was a bruised, magnificent orange. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the shipping containers and the quiet cranes. His unbreakable mindset was restored, his empire purged of the rot. He inhaled the sharp cold air of the harbor, the smell of iron, salt, and victory. He had knelt in the filth so he could see the truth, and now he stood tall as the undisputed ghost of the docks. Behind him, the machinery of the city hummed in a new, disciplined rhythm. The Silent King had returned, and for the first time in a long time, the docks were finally quiet.